morning. We are here with Professor Dr. Bénédicte Savoy, who's Professor of Modern Art History at the Technische Universität in Berlin and also Professor at the Collège de France from 2016 to 2021, among many other honors and awards, and the author, among many other works, of the book Africa's Struggle for Its Art, History of a Post-Colonial Defeat, which is out now from Princeton University Press in a new translation by Susanne Meyer-Abik, who's also joining us. And she'll be speaking with Niels Romer, who's interim dean of the Schools of Arts and Humanities and of Arts and Technology at UT Dallas, as well as director of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies and Rabin Professor of Holocaust Studies. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Your book has a certain arc, right? It has a narrative arc about a process of a continuous attempt to struggle for Africa's art that has continuously been undermined. And there's all that outrage that comes with that realization. But there's a little bit of a sense that, the history is moving forward to greater acknowledgement. There's a certain optimism that comes, right? Comes with the book. And so I'm wondering, how do you feel about that optimism right now? Are we really making now bigger strides?
This book, when it was published in Germany in 1 year ago, had a huge consequence. And the consequence was that Germany engaged for the first time a discussion with Nigeria. Mm-hmm. And that was, so to speak, your book is like a little, not a weapon, but a little instrument. And you try to do something and poof, it worked. And so I'm still optimistic, but the function, the very function of this book is already has worked. And so it has to work again in other contexts, but the objective is reached.
Thank you. Maybe if you don't mind now, just for our listeners who may not have read your book quite yet, if we just give them like a little bit of a kind of sense of what the book is about. I mean, starting with the subtitle, History of a Post-Colonial Defeat. I mean, you're chronicling really, almost 50 years of a attempt of a conversation and of an attempt to come to terms with this. Would you tell us a little bit about that process from the beginning of the book?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very important to know it because we can have the world, people around the world who are thinking about the restitution of cultural heritage for 6 years. We had for a long time the impression to be the first, to be pioneers, to be the first people, maybe with the initiative of the French President Emmanuel Macron in 2017, to speak about the return of cultural heritage to Africa. Working on the so-called Savoy report on restitution of African art with my colleague, Professor Felwine Sarr from Senegal, brought the not only very important insights about the situation of museums in Africa today, or the feeling to see empty spaces in Africa and full spaces with the works, what has been there now in French museums, etc. They are very strong experiences. But one of these experiences, one of the insights working on this report commissioned by Emmanuel Macron was to discover piles of documents, of evidence on a first restitution debate in the 70s and 80s. So the first insight was we had a huge conversation in the world, in the USA, in Europe, in Africa. There were talk shows on TV. There were a lot of documentary films, but also fictional films. There were poems. Even Wole Soyinka, who got the Nobel Prize for Literature, thought about getting back very energetically works from European museums in the 70s. And all of this is forgotten. It didn't work. and it's forgotten now. And for me, it was very important to reconstruct what had been done at that time and why it failed. And that's the content of this book. And that's also the explanation for this title, not only Africa's struggle for its art, but also the history of a post-colonial defeat, because it was a defeat for the African continent, but I think also for Europe. We missed the target zone to do something right. And now, 50 years later, we are doing the work again. Not we. We are the children of the people who did not the work 50 years ago. The new generation are doing the job now.
If we go back into the 70s, our chronology usually accentuates the late 70s, early 80s, precisely with that moment when Germany and Germany's population in a larger way comes to terms with the aftermath of the Holocaust, but also with its true meaning. So possibly that is, with biggest quotation mark, one of the kind of tentative success stories, while you are rightly pointing out two entirely failed opportunities. Do you have any sense of what's, looking back at this, why is there some success and on the other side such failure?
It's very, very interesting in Europe, or we have it. Now it's a little bit different, but 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was almost impossible in Germany to say your marvelous ethnologische museum, your big Humboldt Forum in the middle of Berlin are the product of colonialism. All of these collections were brought to Germany in these very 30 years of German colonialism, etc. And the same in France, the same in the UK, etc. Now it's possible now the time for denial is over. In the last 5 years, nobody would say, no, our collections are safe or are disconnected from this history. And so I think maybe we have to do all this research work on this historical evidence of violence, of brutality, of the connection between museums and colonialism. And after that, we will have to take decisions. It's not only about knowing the history, like in the Holocaust. It's not only about transparency, but also about reparation, restitution, healing of traumas, etc., avoiding to re-traumatize all the involved person.
No, thank you for elaborating a little bit more on this. The other part that I found really fascinating in your book is you call it the German debate on and off, but then it's also very distinctly sometimes about Bremen, and it's different in Berlin. So there's this very clear sense that some of the regional museums tend to Bremen, I think, is one that you're singling out. Seems to follow a slightly different path. So I found that also really interesting how in the German case, because also you have that strange story of the East Berlin and West Berlin, that in lots of ways the German debate at times really is many voices of sorts, right? It's on the East and on the West. It's in Munich, it's in Hamburg, it's in Bremen. So it's interesting to me how multi-layered it is, but how on the whole it just nonetheless follows a very clear trajectory. East-West doesn't seem to be such a significant divider for this neither, right? Could you speak a little bit about the East and West in particular?
Absolutely. I think this designation of a German debate, it's not from me, it's from an American journalist, an American journal in 79 or 78. They said from America, from the US, they said that's a German debate. And it was at that time absolutely true, but one of the reasons was one museum director in Bremen Überseemuseum, because he how do you say, he leaked, he gave a lot of very restricted, very not official informations to the press. And so it was possible suddenly to know what was happening in the administrations in Germany, and what that was that these things what were happening in German administration were also happening in the UK, in France, in Belgium, but very hidden. And suddenly this guy called Ganselmeier, Herbert Ganselmeier, he was 35 years, and he lived for a while in Nigeria. He was very connected with the Nigerian intelligence, with archaeologists like Ekpo Eyo. And for him, returning to Germany, it was clear that something should be done. And one of his methods was to leak all the information, the secret information, and to do a kind of guerrilla against the other directors in Germany. So you have something like because Niels, you described it very accurate as a multiple light discussion. It was also between the generations, because in Germany at that time, not only in Germany, but in Germany it's very visible, the generation of museums directors who were saying no to all the claims from Africa, they were old Nazis, if you want. They were 60s, and they had huge careers as lawyers or Juristen, that it's called in German, in the Nazi apparat, like the first director of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz. And you have this old generation who is racist, who is absolutely still in the idea of the 19th century, with this connection between museums and national affirmation, and you have younger ones. Then you have men and women. Women are not in the administrations. Women are, for example, reading letters to newspapers. Susanne has a lot, or translated a lot of voices from women in the UK, writing to the Times, to the Londoner Times, and saying, "Oh, we have to be friends to Ghana. We can't reproduce every time all these colonial stereotypes, etc." And you have also East and the Cold Creek. You have East and West Berlin having different strategies to charm the non-aligned African countries like Nigeria. And you have and you have 10 or 12 very important ethnological museums in Germany. In the 70s, they had to write together. In Paris, you have only the Musée de l'Homme at that time, the Musée d'Ethnographie, and they don't need to write a lot of letters. In the UK, you have the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's in London. But in Germany, you have to write letters. And for us, for historians, 50 years later, it's like a gift, because you have all this internal communication on paper. And even when they had phone call, they write it, they did protocols of that. And it's one of the reasons, because it's in this book, I focused on the German case because the material is so rich, but the contents are the same or almost the same in Belgium, France, and in the UK, the 4 colonial owners of huge collections in Europe.
Thank you. Let me give Ben Lima maybe also a chance to chime in. You want to jump in?
Yes, you called attention to the importance of collective emotions in, the motivating some kind of developments, and even cited as far back as in Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, warning about the consequences that would happen if the treasures of Troy were pillaged. So I wondered if you could speak about how collective emotions are represented or translated into concrete kinds of laws or actions. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of different possibilities for how these things can be expressed or even repressed also, as you mentioned.
Absolutely. Maybe I can begin with a repression of emotions, because it was something in our time, in our debate right now. Maybe you have heard or you know that it's very often, if somebody is pro restitution, or if somebody at the university, but also activists or African people say we want to have our stuff back, and one of the remarks or responses were in the last few years, "Oh, you are too emotional. It's an it's too emotional. We can't speak so emotional. We have to de-emotionalize the debate, etc." And for me, it was very interesting, because first of all, art, religious artifacts, sacred objects, etc., are emotional. Museums are art for aesthetical emotion, intellectual emotions, etc. So for me, it was strange to see how museums people were saying, "Oh, we have to de-emotionalize," and it was a, how do you say, eureka moment, like wow. When I found in archives a document by 10 museum directors, a document from 78 with instructions how to cope, how to respond to demands from Africa. And one of the chapters, a little paragraph in this very important document, in this memorandum, is called Emotionalität. It's about emotions, collective emotions. And the museum directors in Germany said at that time, we have to abwehren, to fight. Abwehren is it's a word with bear too. Susanne, what do you say? Abwehren?
You defend, like a military defense.
Yes, it's a military word. Wir müssen Emotionen abwehren. We have to fight against emotionality, because emotionality or emotionality is on the side of the public, of the public opinion. The public opinion is very emotional, and for us, if we let these emotions raise, we will be the victims of these emotions. And the response was, each time if you hear something about emotions or something emotional, we museums, we have to respond with juridical arguments, with the law. And that's very interesting. And the collective emotions are not only collective emotions, indeed also individual emotions had a very important role in the 60s and 70s by poets, by filmmakers, speaking about from Africa, from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Benin, from France, speaking about their feelings in a British museum or in France, in a Musée d'Ethnographie, seeing all these pieces from Africa. And I think emotions are are at the center of all our discussion, but emotions connected with our humanity.
Thank you. Can we maybe just also ask me, on the one side, a little bit about the translation, but Susanne, you're more than just a translator. You're very much also part of the conversations about looted art and all of this. Do you mind just telling us a little bit both about the act of translating, but also I believe you're otherwise the director of one of the organizations that helps in Berlin with inquiries about looted art.
Well, I have a day job apart from being a translator of mostly academic texts on arts and culture. My main job is I am not the head of the German Lost Art Foundation, but I am the director of the so-called help desk at the Lost Art Foundation, which was installed about 3 years ago to offer a point of contact where families who had lost cultural assets during the Holocaust could basically contact someone in this maze of federal systems, and basically get some basic support. And so that's leads us back to the Holocaust, which is one of my subjects that I've been working on in my career. But I have to say, it was great to branch out into Bénédicte's field, and this book, for a translator of academic texts, which, even the best of them can be a little dry. And this book was such a page turner that I was looking forward to the next chapter as I finished the last one. It's like, tomorrow I start the next chapter.
One could also say that the looting of these objects facilitated also a particular way of telling the history of the world. In many ways, the objects stood in for a particular production of knowledge. They gave rise and substantiated a particular racist view of the world and respectively of other societies. So my question is, how in your mind is the kind of debate about the objects hopefully also at some point helping to undo the other, or to at least challenge the other? In other words, the thoughts that are still very much in the minds of, like you said, of these actors in the 70s and 80s, but presumably also still in the minds of many in the 21st century. We're not entirely done yet. So how much is this colonial knowledge, so to speak, the kind of construction of the other, the racism that came along with it? How do we, that's not just an issue of restitution. This is a way of challenging our institutions, our museums, of having to find new ways of being relevant, maybe, and of telling their stories. Or what's your view on this?
You're completely right. I think 2 years ago, I would have said or answer, yes, the question of racism, it's very connected to museums. It's obvious. We have the European museums and the non-European museum for the others, and the others are something to study, etc. It was a very important topic. Now, I observed the situation after the first very important restitution by France to the Republic of Benin at the end of 2021, when France gave back 2.5 tons of royal material to the former Dahomey, which is now the Republic of Benin. Now, because the objects are back, you can observe a very important discussion about epistemologies, about the universalism of some epistemologies or taxonomies. These objects have been categorized and understood in lists, in weight, in categories from the 19th century, who are very close to Linné for the botanical world, and in the museum world you had something like a Linné order for these works. And now, coming back, they are in this moment in Africa you have colleagues at universities, but also artists thinking about, which language shall we speak with them?
Your interest, a discussion of the terminology was very interesting. For example, controversy about the term restitution, as well as your research on this concept of translocation. And it seems obviously that the terminology or the words that are used influence our understanding. And if you could maybe just speak briefly about your sense of the significance of the different terms that are used.
Yes, absolutely. All our syntax, our words are the product of these 18th, 19th century. You can begin with the word collection. To collect is something like to collect flowers, but we are speaking about war booty in a lot of cases. That's one of these words. Or we have also these words have a perspective in it. When we are speaking with our colleagues from Cameroon, from the University of Chang, with Professor Boifo and his team working on an atlas of the absence of the cultural heritage in Cameroon, our colleagues are not in Cameroon are not very comfortable with the word donor. They are absolutely not comfortable with the word donor, and they say, let's better speak about takers. It's not about, they took it. And all these words have a perspective, and it's very important to reflect if you are speaking from the European perspective with donors or from the etc. And the word restitution is, of course, one of the most important, because in the last five decades, the administrations or museum directors who tried to fight against the project of restitution, they said, let's avoid the word restitution, let's speak about circulation or transfer. And it's evident, transfer and circulation are only horizontal, only in the room, the space, while restitution are vertical. You have time in it, you have a temporality, you have a time before, a time now, something to reinstall. And having time in it, you have history. And if you have history, you must be transparent with this history. And if you speak only about circulation, transfer, etc., you don't need to speak about history, and so on and so forth, and so on. So, and yes, terminology, emotions, the scale of these presence of the old material cultures from Africa, only in Europe, not in Asia, in America, in the US, and in Canada, you have very important collections with very spectacular pieces, but not so much. I think in the whole USA, you have the same number of objects from Africa, like in the only city of Vienna. So it's not so much. And in Europe, we have 500,000 of objects only in public collections. So
it's an enormous number. Well, I'll just repeat that the new book, which is out now from Princeton University Press, Africa's Struggle for Its Art, History of a Post-Colonial Defeat by Bénédicte Savoy, translated by Susanna Meyer-Abik. Thank you both very much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having us.